Her husband divorced her 10 minutes after she gave birth to twins. The words would later spread through the quiet halls of St. Mary's Medical Center like a rumor no one wanted to believe. But in room 314 the air was already heavy with a silence that felt almost unreal. Emily Carter lay back against the hospital bed, exhausted in the soft, floating way only a new mother could understand, her arms trembling slightly as she held the two tiny blankets resting against her chest. Each bundle weighed barely 6 pounds, warm and impossibly small, their slow breathing rising and falling like the calm rhythm of a tide. For a moment, the entire world had narrowed to that gentle sound. After 14 hours of labor, after months of swollen ankles and restless nights, Emily had finally met the two boys she had dreamed about for nearly a year. She brushed her finger across the cheek of the baby on the left, a tiny face framed by a knit blue cap the nurse had carefully pulled over his head. The other twin stirred softly beside him, making a faint squeaking noise that caused Emily to smile through the exhaustion. Outside the room, the muted sounds of rolling carts and distant conversations drifted through the corridor. Boston in early November was cold, the gray afternoon sky pressing softly against the hospital windows, but inside room 314 there had been warmth only seconds before the door opened. Emily looked up, expecting to see a nurse returning to check the baby's vitals. Instead, Daniel Carter stepped into the room. Her husband paused just inside the doorway, his dark coat still on, the sharp scent of winter air following him inside. For a moment, Emily's tired mind struggled to understand why he looked so different from the man she had imagined during those long hours of labor. She had pictured him smiling, maybe holding flowers, maybe even crying the way he had promised he would when their children were finally born. But Daniel wasn't smiling. His expression was distant, almost unreadable, and in his hand was a plain manila envelope. Emily's smile faded slightly. "Danny," she whispered softly, her voice fragile after hours of strain. "They're here." She shifted the blankets gently so he could see the two tiny faces. "Our boys." For a few seconds Daniel didn't move closer. He simply stood there, eyes moving from Emily to the babies and back again, as if studying something he didn't quite recognize. The silence stretched long enough that Emily felt a strange chill crawl across the room. Finally he stepped forward, but instead of leaning over the bed or reaching toward the twins, he placed the envelope on the small tray beside her hospital bed. The sound of paper against metal seemed far louder than it should have been. Emily frowned faintly. "What's that?" Daniel's voice was calm, almost businesslike. "Divorce papers." The words landed with a quiet finality that made the entire room feel suddenly smaller. Emily blinked, convinced for a second that exhaustion had scrambled her hearing. "What?" Daniel looked down at the babies again, his expression tightening. "Those kids can't be mine." The sentence hung in the air like a crack in glass. Emily felt her heartbeat stumble. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" But Daniel had already pulled a pen from his pocket, sliding the envelope closer to her trembling hand, as if this moment had been planned long before she ever arrived at the hospital. Emily stared at the envelope as if it were something poisonous. Her fingers tightened around the soft hospital blankets, instinctively pulling the twins closer to her chest. For a moment she could not speak. The quiet beeping of the heart monitor beside the bed suddenly sounded louder than it had before, steady and mechanical, marking each passing second of disbelief. "Daniel, you cannot be serious," she finally whispered, her voice thin with exhaustion. But Daniel did not laugh, and he did not take the envelope back. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked down at the two newborn boys as if they were strangers placed in the wrong room. "I am completely serious," he said flatly. "Those children are not mine." The words settled over the room like a cold fog. Emily felt her chest tighten. "You are looking at your sons," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "They were just born. You were supposed to be here." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I did the math, Emily. The timing does not make sense. And twins." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Twins do not run in my family." Emily blinked in confusion. What does that have to do with anything? But Daniel had already turned slightly toward the door, where a young nurse had paused. After hearing raised voices, the nurse held a clipboard against her chest, unsure whether she should enter or leave. Daniel gestured toward her, and then toward the babies. "I want a DNA test," he said clearly. The nurse looked startled. "Sir, The babies were just delivered less than 30 minutes ago. The mother needs time to recover. I am not leaving this hospital without knowing the truth, Daniel replied. Emily felt a wave of dizziness pass through her. Only minutes earlier she had believed she was living the happiest moment of her life. Now she felt as if the ground had quietly shifted beneath the hospital bed. Daniel, listen to yourself, she said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. I carried these babies for 9 months. You went with me to the appointments. You heard their heartbeats. Daniel's expression remained unmoved. And now I want proof. Emily felt tears gather in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of him. Not now. Not when she was still holding the 2 fragile lives that depended on her. One of the twins stirred again, making a small sleepy sound. Emily instinctively adjusted the blanket around him, brushing her finger gently across his tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around her skin without hesitation. The simple trust of that movement nearly broke her heart. Daniel watched the scene for a moment, but there was no softness in his eyes. Instead, he reached into the envelope and slid a document halfway out, tapping the line where her signature would go. Sign it now, he said. We can finish the paperwork quickly. Emily looked at the pen in his hand as if it belonged to a stranger. Before she could respond, another voice entered the room. I think this conversation might need a pause. The words came from the doorway behind Daniel. A tall man in a white coat had stepped quietly into the room, holding a tablet in one hand. His name badge read Dr. Michael Hayes. He had been the attending physician during Emily's delivery, and his calm presence had guided the entire medical team through the long hours of labor. Dr. Hayes glanced from Emily to the babies and then to Daniel, clearly sensing the tension that had filled the room. Mr. Carter, he said gently, your wife has just completed a very difficult delivery. This is not the moment to make major legal decisions. Daniel lifted his chin slightly. Doctor, with all due respect, this is exactly the moment. I just want the truth. Dr. Hayes studied him quietly. Then he looked down at the twins again, his eyes lingering for a few seconds longer than expected. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, he opened the tablet in his hand and reviewed a few notes from the delivery report. The room grew silent again except for the soft breathing of the 2 newborn boys. Finally, Dr. Hayes raised his eyes and looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Carter, he said calmly, before we talk about DNA tests, there is something I would like to ask you. Daniel frowned slightly. What is it? The doctor's voice remained steady and quiet. Were you born through in vitro fertilization? The question seemed so unexpected that Daniel froze where he stood. Daniel Carter did not answer right away. The question seemed to drain the certainty from his face. For the first time since he had walked into the room, his confidence faltered. What does that have to do with anything? He asked slowly, his voice no longer as sharp as before. Dr. Michael Hayes remained calm, standing beside the hospital bed with the quiet patience of someone who had spent years watching complicated moments unfold in rooms just like this one. Please answer the question, the doctor said gently. Daniel hesitated, glancing briefly at Emily and then back at the doctor. Yes, he finally admitted. My parents told me when I was a teenager. They had trouble having children, so they used in vitro fertilization. Dr. Hayes nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. The nurse near the door shifted slightly but stayed silent, sensing that something important was unfolding. Emily looked between the 2 men, confusion filling her tired eyes. She had never heard this detail before. In all their years of marriage, Daniel had never mentioned it. The doctor glanced down at the twins resting against Emily's chest, their tiny faces peaceful and unaware of the tension surrounding them. Then he looked back at Daniel. Mr. Carter, there is a rare genetic pattern that sometimes appears in individuals conceived through assisted reproductive methods during the early years of that technology, he explained slowly. It is not common, but when it occurs, it can increase the probability of fraternal twins in the next generation. Daniel frowned. What are you saying? Dr. Hayes tapped lightly on the tablet in his hand, bringing up the initial medical screening that had already been recorded after the babies were delivered. Both of these boys show markers that strongly suggest they inherited a particular gene variation from their father, he said. It is unusual, but it is medically documented. The room became very still. Daniel's eyes moved back toward the babies, lingering there longer than before. You are telling me that twins could come from my side of the family? He asked quietly. Dr. Hayes gave a small nod. Yes. In fact, based on what I am seeing in their charts, it is far more likely that they inherited this trait from you than from their mother. Emily felt her breath catch. She looked down at the two small faces resting against her, their cheeks soft and pink beneath the hospital lights. For the first time since Daniel had walked into the room, a fragile spark of relief began to push through the exhaustion in her chest. Daniel remained silent, staring at the twins as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The envelope with the divorce papers still rested on the tray beside the bed, but now it seemed strangely out of place in the quiet hospital room. One of the babies stretched slightly, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. The sound echoed gently through the space between them. Dr. Hayes closed the tablet and folded his arms loosely. Of course, he said calmly. A DNA test can always confirm the science. But medically speaking, there is nothing here that suggests these boys are not your children. Daniel's hand slowly lowered to his side, the pen slipping quietly from his fingers onto the floor. Emily watched him carefully, waiting for him to speak. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "I did not know." And in that quiet realization, the certainty that had filled the room only minutes earlier began to crumble. Daniel sank into the chair near the hospital bed, his eyes fixed on the two small lives he had almost rejected in a heartbeat. Emily watched him silently, her breathing still steady despite the whirlwind of emotions that had carried her from disbelief to cautious relief. Dr. Michael Hayes remained by the foot of the bed, observing quietly, his presence steady and non-judgmental. Daniel's hand reached out slowly, hovering just above the soft blankets covering the twins, unsure if he had the right, unsure if he could bridge the gap he had created in mere minutes. One of the babies stirred and stretched, tiny fingers brushing against Daniel's hand, and the man inhaled sharply as a new reality settled in his chest. I did not know, he whispered again, voice low, as if repeating the truth might make it more real. Emily allowed a small, cautious smile to touch her lips, leaning back slightly, but keeping the twins close, feeling the rhythm of their breathing sync with her own. The hospital room, previously heavy with accusation and tension, now felt quieter, filled with a sense of fragile understanding. Daniel's gaze shifted between the boys and Emily, and for the first time, he saw not just children and a wife, but a family he had almost destroyed. He swallowed hard, his usual confidence replaced by a careful humility that seemed almost foreign. Dr. Hayes spoke again, calm and precise. Genetics do not lie, Mr. Carter. These children share your markers, the same ones that are extremely rare. You are their father in every measurable way. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind racing as he processed the weight of the words. Emily's eyes softened, her own exhaustion blending with relief and a lingering wariness. So, the boys are mine? He asked, barely above a whisper. Dr. Hayes gave a gentle nod. The realization pressed against Daniel's chest, a mixture of shame and awe as he glanced at Emily, who remained seated with a protective hand over the twins. The tension that had gripped the room for over an hour slowly lifted, replaced with the kind of quiet introspection that comes when a truth unravels a misunderstanding that could have defined a lifetime. Emily allowed herself a deep breath, feeling a small surge of hope and the possibility of reconciliation glimmer in the soft light filtering through the hospital blinds. Daniel reached out more decisively, his hand gently resting on Emily's arm without touching the babies, a silent acknowledgement of the trust he had almost lost. The nurse returned briefly, checking vitals, her expression noting the shift in mood without a word. Dr. Hayes remained calm, his eyes reflecting satisfaction at the resolution of the confusion, knowing the delicate balance of new life, fragile hearts, and the revelation of truth had shifted in favor of clarity and understanding. Daniel's gaze remained on the twins, his thoughts clearly racing, realizing in a quiet, intimate way that the moments he had tried to control were no longer his to dictate, and that the family before him, fragile and tender, demanded his respect, patience, and awareness in a way he had never anticipated. Emily felt the subtle shift as Daniel's posture softened, the rigid lines of anger easing into a cautious acknowledgement of reality, the room filled with a quiet, unspoken reconciliation, a moment suspended between past mistakes and the potential for new beginnings. The babies stirred once more, small cries that brought a renewed warmth to Emily's chest, and Daniel's hand moved slightly, almost instinctively, offering a tentative connection. Dr. Hayes stepped back, giving them space, and the soft hum of the hospital equipment became a steady rhythm underlining the possibility that even after shock and accusation, understanding and clarity could emerge, leaving a delicate sense of hope in its wake. The room grew softer as the initial tension began to dissolve into a cautious calm. Emily adjusted the blankets around the twins, gently rocking them as their small eyes fluttered open, gazing at the ceiling above the hospital room with curiosity only newborns could possess. Daniel remained seated in the chair, his posture slowly easing as he studied the tiny features of the boys, the subtle resemblance to himself now undeniable. His fingers hovered over the blankets, uncertain at first, before tentatively reaching out to brush a soft tuft of hair from one twin's forehead. Emily watched silently, feeling the fragile thread of connection strengthen with each careful movement. Dr. Michael Hayes stood at a respectful distance, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, his presence reassuring without intrusion. The soft beeping of the monitors created a steady rhythm, marking the passage of time as Daniel's voice finally broke the quiet. "They really are ours," he said softly, almost as if speaking it aloud would make the truth permanent. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with relief, not tears of sorrow but of hard-won endurance. She could feel her heart pulse with the mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a tentative hope for the future. Slowly, Daniel's hand moved more decisively, gently resting against the blanket, covering the second twin, feeling the warmth and tiny movements beneath. Emily allowed herself a small, steadying breath, sensing that the immediate danger of disbelief and accusation had passed. The subtle light from the window fell across the twins' tiny hands and the soft curves of their faces, highlighting the quiet miracle of life that had just been affirmed. Daniel leaned forward slightly, speaking in a tone both reverent and tentative. "I cannot believe how much they look like me, even with their tiny fingers and toes. It is incredible." Emily smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her own forehead as she considered the journey that had brought them to this point, the years of doubt, exhaustion, and resilience that had finally converged in this quiet room. The twins shifted again, small noises breaking the silence, and Daniel's eyes softened even further, a clear shift from the rigid certainty that had dominated the room before the doctor's intervention. He whispered, almost to himself, "I should have trusted you from the beginning." Emily did not answer immediately, letting the moment linger as a bridge between past mistakes and the tentative rebuilding of trust. She adjusted the blankets once more, holding the twins close to her chest, and felt the steady rhythm of their breathing align with her own heartbeat, a silent affirmation of life and truth. Dr. Hayes nodded to himself, satisfied with the quiet resolution that had taken shape, then took a step back to allow Emily and Daniel the space to connect with the twins on their own terms. The soft hum of the hospital equipment and the filtered light through the blinds created an atmosphere of peace and contemplation, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room moments before. Daniel's gaze lingered on the babies, then on Emily, and he reached slowly to take her hand gently in his, a gesture of acknowledgement and tentative reconciliation. The weight of the earlier confrontation seemed to lift, leaving behind a room filled with quiet understanding, fragile hope, and the potential for a renewed connection built on truth and shared responsibility for the lives of their sons. The hospital room had settled into a quiet rhythm as the soft glow of the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, warm streaks across the floor. Emily adjusted the blankets, tucking the twins closer to her chest while Daniel sat nearby, watching intently, his fingers tracing the edge of the chair, as if finding balance in the reality unfolding before him. Each small movement of the babies drew a subtle reaction from him, a lift of the eyebrows, a shift in posture, a softening of his expression that had been rigid just hours earlier. Dr. Michael Hayes remained at a distance, observing without interference, the faint hum of the monitors punctuating the silence and reinforcing the gentle life that had just been affirmed. Emily glanced at Daniel, noting the change in his demeanor, a quiet humility replacing the earlier arrogance, the recognition of a truth that had been obscured by doubt. "They are ours," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion, yet laced with the firmness of undeniable fact. Daniel nodded slowly, allowing the words to resonate, reaching a part of his mind that had resisted acknowledgement. He leaned forward, his hand hovering above one of the twins before he gently laid it on the soft blanket, feeling the warmth of tiny fingers pressing instinctively against him. Emily watched him, sensing a cautious bridge being built, a tentative trust beginning to form as the weight of the earlier accusations eased from the room. The twins stirred slightly, their soft cries blending with the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, a sound that now felt comforting, a reminder of the life and connection that had persisted despite misunderstanding. Daniel's gaze softened further, tracing the contours of the twins' tiny faces, noting the small features that mirrored his own subtly, the gentle curve of a nose, the shape of a hand, the slight angle of a cheek. Emily allowed a small smile to touch her lips, feeling the warmth of relief settle slowly in her chest, the exhaustion tempered by the realization that the immediate crisis had passed. Dr. Hayes finally spoke, his voice calm and precise, emphasizing clarity over authority. "Mr. Carter, the markers confirm what is already evident. These children share your genetic traits, a clear indication of parentage." Daniel exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders loosening, and he shifted slightly closer to the bed, his hand resting lightly on Emily's arm without overstepping, a silent acknowledgement of her presence and the trust she had maintained. Emily felt the subtle power of that gesture, a recognition that even in moments of doubt and accusation, connection and understanding could emerge, fragile but undeniable. The room seemed to breathe with a new cadence, a rhythm dictated by tiny hearts beating steadily against blankets, by the warmth of shared space and newly acknowledged truths. Daniel's eyes moved between the twins and Emily, seeing the lives they had created and the moments they had endured, and for the first time, a quiet awareness settled in him, a recognition of responsibility and the value of patience, trust, and presence. Emily leaned back slightly, holding the twins close, feeling their soft breaths and tiny movements, and Daniel mirrored her actions cautiously, acknowledging the reality he had almost denied, letting the weight of truth and new understanding guide his next steps as the afternoon light continued to fill the room with the quiet promise of hope, reconciliation, and the careful rebuilding of trust. As the afternoon light shifted to a softer amber, the hospital room carried a newfound calm, punctuated only by the gentle breaths of the twins resting against Emily's chest. Daniel remained seated, leaning forward slightly, observing the tiny movements and the subtle expressions crossing their faces. Each small yawn or stretch drew his attention, and he realized with a quiet awe how fragile and perfect these new lives were. Emily adjusted the blankets again, smoothing the soft cotton over their chests, and glanced at Daniel, noting the careful consideration in his eyes, the way he seemed to measure every action before reaching out. Slowly, Daniel extended his hand, this time brushing gently against the twin closest to him, feeling the warmth and the slight resistance of tiny muscles beneath the soft blanket. The baby stirred slightly, and Daniel's eyes widened at the delicate touch of life so entirely dependent on them. Emily allowed herself a faint smile, sensing that this was the beginning of understanding, a bridge forming where only tension had existed before. Dr. Michael Hayes stepped back, giving them space, his calm presence reinforcing the sense of order and quiet in the room. "They are truly remarkable," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of reverence and tentative wonder, the weight of the earlier confrontation finally yielding to a new awareness. Emily nodded, holding the twins closer, feeling the steady warmth and rhythmic breathing that tethered them all together. For the first time since the birth, Daniel leaned closer, his gaze shifting between Emily and the babies, absorbing the small, perfect details that mirrored him in subtle ways. The curve of a cheek, the tiny, curling fingers, the way their eyes followed movement with a gentle focus. "I cannot believe I almost let doubt overshadow this," he whispered, barely audible, a confession carried by the quiet intimacy of the room. Emily's hand brushed against his as he reached for the blanket, and for a fleeting moment, their fingers touched, a small gesture of reconciliation and acknowledgement. The soft beeping of the monitors and the occasional coo of the babies created a gentle rhythm, underscoring the quiet understanding forming in the space. Daniel spoke again, this time more firmly but still gentle. I want to be present, to understand, to learn how to be part of this, for both of them and for you. Emily's eyes softened further, her exhaustion mingling with relief and cautious hope. She offered a small nod, feeling the possibility of partnership beginning to bloom, not rushed, not forced, but quietly recognized. The afternoon light deepened, casting long shadows that danced across the walls and the floor, reflecting off the soft blankets and the pale hospital sheets, creating a scene of fragile harmony. Dr. Hayes observed silently, knowing that the delicate tension had shifted to understanding, and that these small, quiet actions were more powerful than any words of reassurance could be. Daniel's gaze lingered on the twins, and he carefully adjusted the blanket around the second infant, his touch light but attentive, conveying a growing sense of responsibility and presence. Emily felt a deep, steadying breath pass through her, the warmth of the children against her chest a comforting anchor, and in that moment, both she and Daniel understood the fragile yet undeniable thread of connection that had been restored, a recognition of shared care, mutual trust, and the quiet, unspoken commitment to nurture these small, perfect lives together in the hours, days, and years to come. The late afternoon sunlight softened further, casting a warm glow over the pale walls and hospital sheets, creating a serene contrast to the storm that had erupted just hours before. Emily carefully shifted the twins, adjusting their tiny blankets so that both rested comfortably against her chest, feeling the steady warmth that seemed to steady her own pulse. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he observed, his gaze tracing the delicate movements of each baby with a newfound attentiveness that replaced the uncertainty from earlier. The soft coos and gentle sighs of the twins filled the room, each sound a reminder of life and connection, a rhythm that had slowly begun to align the three of them. Dr. Michael Hayes stood a few steps away, his presence steady but unobtrusive, offering Emily and Daniel the space to navigate the quiet intimacy of the moment. Daniel's eyes softened further as he noticed the subtle expressions on the babies' faces, the tiny curl of a hand, the gentle blink of an eyelid, the way their lips formed a delicate pout in sleep. He swallowed hard, the reality of the morning's tension giving way to awe and cautious reverence. They are so small, he murmured, voice low, almost in disbelief, and yet so alive. Emily smiled faintly, feeling a measure of relief at his words, the first acknowledgement of wonder rather than accusation since the birth. Daniel's hand moved slowly toward the blanket covering one twin, brushing lightly across the soft fabric, careful not to disturb the infant's delicate rest. The baby stirred slightly, and Daniel's eyes widened at the touch, realizing the weight and fragility of the tiny life that had just come into the world. Emily watched him, sensing a tentative connection forming, a bridge across the gap that doubt and misunderstanding had created. Dr. Hayes stepped back, observing the scene quietly, the soft hum of the monitors marking the gentle passage of time. Daniel leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I cannot believe I almost rejected them, almost doubted everything. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the twins, feeling the warmth of the moment and the quiet power of truth settling over them. She adjusted the blankets again, ensuring both babies were secure and comfortable, and allowed herself a slow, steadying breath. The room, once thick with tension and disbelief, now carried a soft rhythm of observation, care, and tentative reconciliation. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hands reaching toward Emily's arm in a careful, unintrusive gesture, acknowledging both her presence and the reality of shared responsibility. Emily responded with a faint smile and a subtle squeeze of his hand, a silent affirmation of the fragile understanding forming between them. The twins stirred once more, small noises that seemed to affirm their presence and vitality, and Daniel's attention returned to them fully, his gaze steady and full of awareness. The afternoon light deepened, stretching across the blankets and walls, highlighting the quiet, tender scene of two parents slowly reconnecting through the shared wonder of their children. Each breath, Each small movement, each careful glance created a rhythm that spoke of hope, resilience, and the beginning of trust rebuilding. Emily felt the weight of the hours lift slightly, the moment stretching out with gentle significance, and Daniel remained attentive, silent yet profoundly present, allowing the soft continuity of life and truth to guide their first tentative steps toward mutual understanding and the delicate nurturing of their twins' new beginning. The hospital room settled into a quiet, almost meditative calm as the sun dipped lower, casting long, gentle shadows across the pale walls and floor. Emily adjusted the blankets around the twins, feeling their steady warmth and tiny movements, a subtle reassurance that life persisted even after the turmoil of the morning. Daniel remained seated, leaning slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the two small faces with a mixture of awe and tentative understanding. Every twitch of a finger, every small stretch, every soft sigh drew his attention, and he realized how utterly delicate and precious these new lives were. Dr. Michael Hayes stood back, silent and observant, allowing the parents space to navigate the unfolding intimacy of their family without interruption. Daniel reached out slowly, brushing a small hand over the blanket covering one twin, and the baby stirred slightly, eliciting a soft smile from him. Emily watched quietly, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his shoulders relaxed and the tension in his posture softened. "They are ours," she whispered gently, her voice carrying a calm certainty that had been absent hours before. Daniel nodded, still gazing at the twins, absorbing the reality of the moment, the gravity of responsibility and connection settling into his chest. He leaned closer, speaking in a low, reverent tone. "I cannot believe I almost let doubt shadow this moment." Emily's hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture of acknowledgement and shared understanding, and Daniel returned the touch with careful, measured pressure, signaling the beginning of a fragile reconciliation. The twins shifted again, tiny noises filling the room, and Daniel's eyes followed their movements intently, noting the subtle traits and features that reflected both of them. In miniature, he whispered softly, "I want to be here, to learn, to understand what it means to be their father." Emily allowed herself a quiet nod, feeling a cautious hope take root in her chest, the weight of the morning's shock gradually giving way to the gentle promise of partnership. The monitors hummed steadily in the background, providing a rhythm that seemed to sync with the soft breathing of the twins, the measured pace of Daniel's growing attentiveness, and Emily's careful, calming presence. Dr. Hayes watched with satisfaction, recognizing that the difficult early hours had given way to a moment of clarity, understanding, and mutual acknowledgement. Daniel's gaze returned to the twins, and he shifted slightly, gently repositioning the blanket over the second baby, his hands light but deliberate, a silent promise to be present and attentive. Emily observed, her own heart steadied by the unfolding scene, the quiet power of truth and shared care creating a new, fragile equilibrium in the room. Daniel leaned back slightly, eyes lingering on the twins, and then turned to Emily with a soft, tentative smile, the first one unburdened by accusation or doubt. Emily returned the smile subtly, allowing herself to feel the warmth of the connection, the beginnings of trust re-established after moments of near devastation. The twins cooed softly, and Daniel's lips parted in an almost imperceptible exhale of wonder and relief, the reality of their shared family and the fragile, tender moments they now had together settling into the rhythm of the hospital room. Light filtered through the blinds, illuminating the soft blankets and tiny features of the infants, highlighting the quiet miracle of life that had withstood uncertainty, doubt, and fear, leaving in its wake a space filled with careful hope, awareness, and the delicate rebuilding of bonds that would guide them into the hours and days ahead. The hospital lights cast a gentle glow across the room as the afternoon slowly gave way to early evening, the soft shadows stretching over the pale walls and the neatly arranged medical equipment. Emily shifted slightly in the bed, adjusting the twins so that both rested comfortably against her chest, feeling the steady warmth and subtle movements that reminded her of the fragile certainty of life. Daniel remained close, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the chair, eyes fixed intently on the small faces before him. Each movement, Each tiny sound from the infants drew his attention, and he found himself mesmerized by the delicate rhythm of their breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible twitches of their tiny fingers. He leaned forward slowly, his gaze lingering on the twins, taking in the details that mirrored his own features in the most subtle ways. The shape of a nose, the gentle curl of a lip, the small arch of an eyebrow. Emily watched him quietly, noting the transformation in his demeanor, the way tension had given way to awe and careful attentiveness. Dr. Michael Hayes observed from a distance, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, the quiet hum of monitors punctuating the soft sounds of life and connection. Daniel finally spoke in a low, reverent voice. "I cannot believe how quickly everything shifted this morning, how close I came to losing the first moments of their lives to doubt and misunderstanding." Emily nodded slightly, her own exhaustion blending with relief, the quiet strength that had carried her through the day now mingling with the hope that reconciliation could begin in these fragile hours. Daniel's hand hovered above one twin. Then, with a deliberate gentleness, he brushed the soft blanket covering the infant, feeling the subtle warmth and faint resistance beneath, a tangible reminder of the reality he could no longer question. The twin stirred softly, eyes fluttering open, and Daniel's expression softened even more, a quiet smile touching his lips. Emily allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time, the moment of fear replaced by a tentative sense of connection, the understanding that trust, once lost, could be carefully rebuilt. The soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the gentle coos of the infants created a steady background that seemed to knit together the fragile family, each element reinforcing the growing sense of calm and attentiveness in the room. Daniel leaned closer to Emily, his eyes still on the twins, voice quiet yet firm. "I want to learn, to be present, to understand everything I missed while I let my doubts take hold." Emily offered a slight, encouraging nod, feeling the bridge of understanding begin to form in the warmth of the hospital room. The twins shifted slightly, their tiny movements echoing the soft changes in the adults, a natural rhythm that suggested resilience and continuity. Daniel adjusted the blanket around the second twin with careful hands, light yet deliberate, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to see the future not through the lens of doubt or accusation, but as a series of possibilities built upon presence, care, and the shared love of two fragile lives. Emily watched, the faintest smile lingering on her lips, as Daniel continued to observe the twins, his attention fully absorbed, his posture reflecting the tentative promise of renewed trust and quiet commitment. The late afternoon light continued to filter through the blinds, highlighting the soft contours of the infants and the gentle interactions between parents, casting long, golden streaks across the room, a silent witness to the subtle yet profound transformation that had taken place in these small, careful moments. The atmosphere carried a quiet significance, each breath, each tiny movement, each thoughtful gesture underscoring the fragile but undeniable connection beginning to form, leaving Emily and Daniel with the sense that the day, filled with tension and doubt, had finally shifted toward understanding, awareness, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust as the first evening settled over the city outside. The evening deepened outside the hospital, the city lights beginning to shimmer through the windows as the room inside settled into a rare quiet. Emily held the twins close, their tiny bodies nestled against her chest, their breaths rising and falling in a delicate, synchronized rhythm. Daniel remained seated beside her, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he observed the twins with careful attentiveness, his gaze flickering between their delicate features and Emily's steady presence. Each movement of the babies drew his focus, the curl of a tiny fist, the soft flutter of an eyelid, the slight stretch of a leg, and with each subtle gesture, he felt a growing sense of awe and responsibility. Emily adjusted the blankets, ensuring the twins were comfortable and warm, her own heart steadying as she watched Daniel interact with them, noting the shift in his demeanor from doubt and tension to cautious attentiveness and wonder. Dr. Michael Hayes stood silently nearby, monitoring the room, his calm presence a stabilizing force as he allowed the parents to navigate these early, fragile moments. Daniel leaned forward again, whispering softly, "They are incredible. I cannot believe how much they are a part of me." Emily offered a gentle nod, her eyes soft with exhaustion, yet filled with quiet relief, understanding that the early turbulence of the day had given way to a shared sense of clarity and connection. The twins stirred slightly, making small, delicate noises, and Daniel reached out with careful hands to adjust the blanket around the second infant, his touch light and deliberate, a gesture that conveyed both respect and tentative reassurance. Emily's heart lifted slightly as she noticed the careful consideration in his movements, the way he was learning the rhythm and nuance of their tiny lives, a subtle, silent promise forming in each gentle interaction. The monitors continued their steady hum, a quiet reminder of the rhythm of life and the passage of time, reinforcing the calm that had slowly settled over the room. Daniel's gaze returned to Emily, and he spoke in a low, measured tone, "I want to be present. I want to be here for every moment." Emily's hand brushed softly against his, a small gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance, bridging the hours of tension and misunderstanding that had preceded this moment. The twins cooed softly, shifting in response to the warmth and presence surrounding them, their small movements echoing the subtle shift in the adult's attention and emotional state. Daniel leaned forward slightly, watching each tiny motion, a quiet reverence in his eyes, and Emily felt a cautious hope rising, sensing that the fragile beginnings of trust and partnership were now taking hold. Dr. Hayes observed the scene, his expression calm, satisfied that the delicate equilibrium of trust, understanding, and shared care was unfolding naturally. The soft glow from the hospital lights mingled with the distant city illumination, casting a gentle, reassuring warmth across the blankets and the faces of the twins, a visual reminder of the quiet miracle of life and the possibilities that awaited this family. Emily felt the weight of the day lift slightly, replaced by a tempered optimism, the early strains of conflict and doubt giving way to careful attentiveness, mutual respect, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of bonds that would define the days and nights to come. Daniel's eyes remained on the twins, his posture relaxed but attentive, and he gently adjusted the position of the second infant, his movements deliberate, conveying a growing awareness of his role and the quiet responsibility that came with the first moments of parenthood. The room settled into a steady, harmonious rhythm, filled with the small sounds of breathing, soft shifting, and the quiet interplay of trust, care, and emerging understanding between the parents as the city outside continued its evening rhythm, distant but ever present. The evening light had softened into a warm golden hue, spilling through the tall hospital windows and illuminating the room with a quiet serenity. Emily carefully cradled the twins, feeling the steady rise and fall of their tiny chests against her own, the rhythmic warmth a comforting anchor after the tension of the day. Daniel remained seated close by, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the infants as he watched their subtle movements, the gentle stretching of tiny fingers, the soft fluttering of eyelids, and the delicate rise and fall of their breathing. Each small gesture captured his attention, a reminder of the fragile yet remarkable lives resting against Emily's chest. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over one twin, brushing lightly against the soft blanket, feeling the faint warmth beneath and marveling at the delicate nature of these small beings. Emily watched him silently, sensing the shift in his demeanor, the way awe and careful attentiveness had replaced doubt and tension. The monitor's steady beeping provided a calm, rhythmic background, underscoring the stillness and focus within the room. Daniel's voice, low and reverent, finally broke the quiet. "They are so perfectly formed, so connected to us. I cannot believe I ever doubted this moment," he whispered. Emily gave a small, tired smile, feeling the weight of hours of worry and fear slowly lift as the presence of trust and recognition settled in the space between them. She adjusted the blankets once more, ensuring the twins were fully supported and comfortable, and allowed herself a deep, steadying breath. Daniel leaned slightly closer, eyes tracing the subtle lines of the baby's features, noting similarities that mirrored his own: small curls of hair, the soft shape of a cheek, the delicate arch of a brow. "I want to be here for every moment," he said quietly, voice filled with sincerity, to learn how to care for them, to understand their needs, and to support you. Emily's hand brushed lightly against his, a gesture of acknowledgement, a tentative affirmation that connection and collaboration were possible after the storm of doubt. The twins stirred again, their soft, delicate noises punctuating the room, and Daniel's eyes followed their every subtle movement, a growing awareness of responsibility. Shaping his attention, Dr. Michael Hayes remained nearby, observing quietly, allowing the family to navigate these intimate moments at their own pace, his calm presence a stabilizing influence. Daniel gently adjusted the blanket around the second twin, careful to move slowly and deliberately, his actions conveying thoughtfulness and consideration. Emily's eyes softened as she watched him interact with the infants, noting the slow, steady development of presence and attentiveness that had been absent earlier. The hospital lights combined with the fading natural light to create a warm glow across the blankets and the infants' tiny features, highlighting the quiet miracle of life and the unfolding possibility of trust rebuilt. Emily felt a small sense of relief and cautious hope rising in her chest, the day's tension giving way to the delicate beginnings of partnership, mutual understanding, and shared responsibility for the twins' well-being. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the infants, his posture relaxed yet attentive, hands moving carefully to ensure their comfort while respecting Emily's space. The room settled into a gentle rhythm, filled with soft breaths, faint coos, and the quiet interplay of trust, care, and awareness, establishing the fragile but undeniable connection that would guide them forward in the hours and days to come. Each small action, each gentle movement, each careful glance reinforced the sense that the family, though tested and uncertain, was beginning to find its balance and a tentative peace within the quiet sanctuary of the hospital room. The golden light of early evening filled the hospital room, painting the walls and blankets in a soft, comforting glow as Emily held the twins securely against her chest. Their tiny faces pressed gently into her, eyes fluttering open with the slow curiosity of newborns discovering the world, and she felt the steady rhythm of their breathing anchor her in the quiet moment. Daniel remained close by, seated with a careful attentiveness, his hands resting lightly on his knees as he observed, tracing the small features of the twins with eyes full of awe and growing reverence. Each subtle movement of their tiny fingers, each delicate stretch, each soft sigh drew him further into the reality of fatherhood, and he realized the depth of responsibility and care that these fragile lives demanded. Emily adjusted the blankets again, ensuring the twins were comfortable, and glanced at Daniel, sensing the quiet transformation in him, the shift from doubt to presence, from tension to attentiveness. Dr. Michael Hayes stood at a respectful distance, observing the unfolding scene with quiet satisfaction, his calm presence a subtle reminder of the steady guidance that had carried them through the earlier hours of confusion and misunderstanding. Daniel leaned closer to the twins, his voice low and reverent. "I cannot believe how much I almost missed, how close I came to rejecting these moments." Emily's hand brushed lightly against his, a tentative acknowledgement of shared understanding, and he returned the gesture with the same careful consideration, a silent promise forming between them. The twins stirred softly, their quiet coos and subtle movements filling the room with the gentle rhythm of life, reinforcing the quiet bond that was beginning to emerge between parents and children. Daniel carefully adjusted the blanket around the second infant, his touch light but deliberate, ensuring the baby's comfort and safety, and in doing so, he allowed himself a deeper connection to the fragile lives resting against Emily. Emily felt the tension of the day lift, replaced by the tentative warmth of hope and the beginnings of trust rebuilt. She offered a soft, approving nod as Daniel's eyes lingered on the infants, recognizing the delicate balance of responsibility, care, and the unspoken promise of presence. The monitors provided a steady background hum, punctuating the small shifts of movement and the subtle breathing of the twins, reinforcing the rhythm of life and the continuity of the moment. Daniel spoke softly, almost to himself. "I will be here for them, for every moment, for every need." Emily allowed herself a small, quiet smile, a mixture of relief, hope, and cautious optimism, feeling the bridge of understanding between them begin to solidify. The afternoon light deepened, casting long shadows across the room and highlighting the small, perfect features of the infants, the tender interactions between parents, and the quiet triumph of clarity and truth after hours of tension. Each breath, each subtle movement, each gentle gesture reinforced the fragile yet undeniable connection forming, a recognition of the shared responsibility, trust, and care that would guide them into the days and nights ahead. Daniel shifted slightly, ensuring both twins were secure and comfortable, his hands moving with attentive care, his gaze returning to Emily with a soft, steady acknowledgement of partnership, understanding, and the quiet triumph of a family beginning anew, their small, perfect lives enveloped in warmth, presence, and the delicate promise of love that needed no words but was understood in every careful motion and attentive glance.